In the quiet shadows of history, there walks a force more terrible than any army, more devastating than any war. Picture, if you will, the vast steppes of Central Asia in the early 14th century, where the wind carries secrets across endless grasslands and where, beneath the surface of ordinary life, something ancient and deadly begins to stir. The plague, that invisible assassin that would soon reshape the world, did not announce its coming with trumpets or fanfare. It emerged instead from the most humble of places, from the burrows of marmots and rats dwelling in the remote wilderness between China and the Caspian Sea. Here, in the bacterial darkness of rodent blood, lived Yersinia pestis, a microorganism that had existed for millennia, cycling quietly between fleas and their warm-blooded hosts, waiting with the patience that only nature possesses. The Mongol Empire, in its vast and terrible glory, had connected East and West as never before. The Silk Road, that ancient artery of commerce and culture, pulsed with life. Caravans laden with silk and spices, with ideas and innovations, moved steadily from the markets of China to the bazaars of Constantinople. Yet along these same routes, in the bundles of cloth and grain, in the holds of ships and the packs of merchants, travelled unseen passengers. Fleas carrying their microscopic cargo of death hitched rides on rats that thrived in the granaries and warehouses that lined the trade routes. Climate itself seemed to conspire in this gathering catastrophe. The early 14th century witnessed unusual weather patterns across Asia. Droughts and floods displaced both human and animal populations. Rodents, driven from their natural habitats, moved closer to human settlements, seeking the food stored in villages and cities. The delicate ecological balance that had kept the plague confined to isolated pockets in the wilderness began to break down. What had been an occasional, localized outbreak in remote regions now found pathways into the densely populated centers of human civilization. By the 1330s and 1340s, reports began to emerge from China and Central Asia of mysterious and devastating illnesses. Chronicles speak of entire regions depopulated, of caravans that arrived at their destinations with all their members dead. Nestorian Christian gravestones found in Kyrgyzstan, dated to 1338 and 1339, bear inscriptions suggesting death from pestilence. These silent markers in forgotten cemeteries were among the first whispers of the storm that was coming. The disease moved with the rhythm of commerce and conquest. Mongol armies, merchants, pilgrims, all served as unwitting couriers. From the highlands of Central Asia, the plague descended along the trade routes, following the paths worn smooth by centuries of human ambition and enterprise. It traveled south into India, east into China, and west toward the Black Sea, where it would find ships ready to carry it to every corner of the known world. There is something deeply moving about this hidden beginning, this quiet emergence from the wild places of the earth. The plague did not ask permission or announce its intentions. It simply followed the patterns of nature and the pathways of human civilization, patient and inexorable as the turning of seasons. And in the Silk Road cities, in the great hubs where cultures met and mingled, where the wealth of nations was exchanged and dreams of prosperity flourished, the seeds of the greatest catastrophe in human history were being sown, one infected flea, one dying rat at a time. The world did not yet know what was coming. Merchants still bartered, armies still marched, and ordinary people still lived their ordinary lives, unaware that the old world, their world, was already beginning to die. Let us pause here in this quiet moment before everything changed, and look upon the world as it was, innocent and unknowing of the shadow about to fall across it. Medieval Europe in the early 14th century stood at a peculiar crossroads, a civilization that had reached a kind of zenith, yet carried within itself the seeds of its own vulnerability. The population of Europe had grown steadily for 3 centuries, swelling to perhaps 80 million souls. Cities had expanded beyond their ancient walls, and the countryside teemed with villages and farms. From the olive groves of Italy to the forests of Germany, from the vineyards of France to the moors of England, humanity had pressed into every habitable corner of the continent. This was the great medieval demographic boom, and it seemed as though prosperity and growth would continue forever, as though the land and its resources were inexhaustible. Yet beneath this apparent abundance, fragility lurked. The climate had begun to shift subtly, cruelly. The medieval warm period, which had allowed crops to flourish and populations to expand, was giving way to cooler, wetter conditions. Harvests that had once been reliable became uncertain. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 had already demonstrated how quickly prosperity could turn to desperation. Across northern Europe, rain fell incessantly, rotting crops in the fields and turning roads to impassable mud. People starved by the thousands, weakened by malnutrition, their bodies and spirits diminished. Though the famine eventually passed, it left behind a population less robust, more vulnerable than the generation before. Medieval society was structured with rigid precision. At its apex sat kings and nobles, their power derived from vast estates and military might. Below them labored the peasants, bound to the land by feudal obligation, working fields they would never own to produce food for masters they would never equal. The church stood as a pillar of this world, its authority reaching into every aspect of life, from the grandest cathedral to the humblest village chapel. Monks copied manuscripts, priests administered sacraments, and bishops wielded power that rivaled secular lords. Faith was not merely belief, but the very foundation upon which reality rested. Cities, though small by modern standards, pulsed with life and commerce. Florence, Venice, Paris, London, these were centers of trade and craft where merchants grew, wealthy on wool and wine, where bankers invented ever more sophisticated methods of credit and exchange. Guilds regulated every trade, ensuring quality and maintaining the social order. Yet these cities were also crowded, unsanitary places. Streets ran with refuse and waste, houses pressed together, timber and thatch sharing walls, creating perfect conditions for fire and, as it would prove, for disease. Water supplies were often contaminated, and the concept of public health existed only in the most rudimentary form. Medicine, such as it was, rested on ancient theories inherited from Greek and Roman physicians. The body was thought to be governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, and illness resulted from their imbalance. Physicians trained in universities prescribed bloodletting, purging and complex herbal remedies. They consulted astrology and studied urine with great seriousness. Yet for all their learning, they possessed no understanding of infection, no concept of germs or contagion as we understand them today. When illness struck, they were as helpless as their patients, able only to offer comfort and prayers. Trade connected Europe to the wider world. Venetian and Genoese merchants maintained colonies around the Black Sea and in the eastern Mediterranean, where they acquired the silks and spices of Asia. These same merchants, ambitious and enterprising, built fortunes on the exchange between East and West, never imagining that their ships and warehouses might carry something more deadly than any pirate or storm. This was the world on the eve of catastrophe, prosperous yet vulnerable, confident yet fragile, interconnected yet ignorant of the dangers such connections might bring. The people of Europe in 1346 had no reason to suspect that within a few short years, 1/3 to half of them would be dead, that their entire civilization would be shaken to its foundations, that the world they knew would be transformed beyond recognition. History whispers through the pages of forgotten chronicles, and in those whispers we hear the last peaceful moments of a world that would soon know terror beyond imagining. The stage was set, the pieces in place, and now, across the Black Sea, death was coming, carried on ships with black sails and crews already dying at their oars. The storm was about to break. As one chapter closed in Kaffa, another, more terrible, began to unfold across the sunlit lands of the Mediterranean. The plague, having found purchase in the great port cities of Italy, now began its inexorable advance, moving with a speed that confounded contemporary observers and continues to astonish historians today. What should have been a local outbreak became, within months, a pandemic of apocalyptic proportions. From Messina, the disease leaped to other Sicilian cities. Catania, Palermo, Syracuse, each fell in turn to the invisible enemy. The symptoms were unmistakable and horrifying. Victims developed egg-sized swellings called buboes in their lymph nodes, particularly in the groin, armpits, and neck. These buboes were excruciatingly painful, sometimes rupturing and oozing pus and blood. High fever, chills, vomiting of blood, and patches of blackened gangrenous skin marked the disease's progression. Most victims died within 3 to 7 days of symptom onset, though some succumbed within hours. The mortality rate was catastrophic, killing perhaps 70 to 80% of those infected. By early 1348, the plague had reached the Italian mainland. Genoa, Venice, Pisa, Florence. These great commercial and cultural centres became charnel houses. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio would later write in the introduction to his Decameron of the horror he witnessed. He described how the disease passed not only from person to person but seemed to spread through touching the clothes or belongings of the sick. He wrote of pigs that died after rooting through rags discarded by plague victims, of the complete breakdown of normal social bonds, of children abandoned by parents and spouses fleeing from one another. The plague moved faster than any human understanding of disease would have predicted. Part of this rapid spread was due to the nature of the disease itself. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible, existed in multiple forms. The bubonic plague, transmitted by flea bites, was devastating enough. But in some victims, the bacteria invaded the bloodstream causing septicemic plague or entered the lungs causing pneumonic plague. This pneumonic form could spread directly from person to person through respiratory droplets, turning every cough into a potential death sentence. Italy, with its wealth, its dense urban populations, and its extensive trade networks, provided ideal conditions for the plague's expansion. Cities were crowded, sanitation was primitive, and rats and fleas were ubiquitous. The warm Mediterranean climate allowed rat and flea populations to thrive. Trade ships moving constantly between ports carried infected rats and occasionally infected passengers, spreading the disease faster than any courier could ride. From Italy, the pestilence leaped to the south of France. Marseille was struck in January 1348, and from there the disease moved up the Rhône Valley. Avignon, seat of the papacy and one of Christendom's most important cities, was devastated. Pope Clement VI, though he survived, witnessed the death of a quarter of the city's population. The papal physician Guy de Chauliac recorded his observations of the disease, noting its two main forms and the utter helplessness of medical knowledge against it. By spring and summer of 1348, the plague had reached the great cities of France. Paris, the most populous city north of the Alps, saw death on an unprecedented scale. Chronicles speak of mass graves that could not be dug fast enough, of bodies piled in the streets, of a stench that hung over the city like a physical presence. The normal rituals of death, so important in medieval Catholic culture, became impossible. Priests who administered last rites to plague victims often sickened and died themselves, creating a shortage of clergy precisely when people most desperately sought spiritual consolation. Spain, too, felt the plague's terrible touch. Barcelona, Valencia, and other Mediterranean cities were struck in 1348. The disease moved both by sea and by land, following trade routes and pilgrim paths, military roads, and river valleys. It seemed to possess an almost intelligent malevolence, finding every path, exploiting every connection, reaching into every corner of the known world. Meanwhile, forces beyond anyone's control were gathering momentum. The plague was not finished with its conquests. As summer turned to autumn in 1348, the disease was already preparing to leap across the English Channel, to penetrate the forests of Germany, to reach into Scandinavia and the distant lands of the north. The Mediterranean had burned, and now the fire was spreading to engulf all of Europe. No prayer could stop it, no wall could keep it out, no wealth could buy immunity. The pestilence moved with the inevitability of a falling darkness, and those who watched its approach could only wait in terror for their turn to come. On the shores of the Black Sea, in the bustling trading port of Kaffa, the old world was about to collide with something ancient and merciless. The year was 1347, and autumn was settling over the Crimean Peninsula with its customary chill. Genoese merchants, grown wealthy from their position at the crossroads of East and West, went about their business in the fortified colony, unaware that they stood at ground zero of humanity's greatest catastrophe. Kaffa was a city of contradictions and tensions. Inside its walls, Italian merchants conducted their profitable trade, their warehouses filled with silk and spices, their ledgers recording transactions that stretched from China to London. Outside, the Golden Horde, the Mongol successor state that controlled these lands, maintained an uneasy relationship with these foreign merchants. Trade brought wealth, but cultural and religious differences simmered beneath the surface of commerce. In 1346, the Mongol army laid siege to Kaffa following a dispute with the Genoese inhabitants. It should have been a conventional medieval siege, a test of walls and provisions, of patience and military resolve. But this siege would be remembered for something else entirely. Among the Mongol besiegers, men began to fall ill with a mysterious and terrible disease. Soldiers developed grotesque swellings in their groins and armpits, blackened skin, and high fevers. They died in agony, sometimes within days, sometimes within hours. The illness spread through the Mongol camp with terrifying speed. According to the chronicler Gabriele de Mussi, who recorded these events, the Mongol commanders, facing an epidemic that was destroying their army more effectively than any defensive sally, made a decision that would echo through history. They catapulted the corpses of plague victims over the walls of Kaffa into the city itself. Whether this account is entirely accurate remains debated by historians, but what is certain is that the plague entered Kaffa, and the Genoese, along with other merchants and sailors, were exposed to the contagion. As the disease took hold within Kaffa's walls, panic replaced commerce. The Genoese, desperate to escape the pestilence that was killing their companions and families, made for their ships. In the autumn of 1347, several vessels departed from Kaffa's harbour, their holds filled with goods, their crews already carrying the invisible seed of death. These ships turned west, toward home, toward Italy, toward the heart of Europe. The voyage across the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean was a nightmare. Sailors fell ill and died at their posts. The distinctive buboes appeared, the fever consumed, and bodies were committed to the sea. Some ships arrived at their destinations with most of their crews dead or dying, ghost ships piloted by the doomed. When these vessels put into port at Constantinople, at Messina in Sicily, at Genoa itself, they brought with them not just cargo but catastrophe. At Messina, in October 1347, the horror became undeniable. Ships from Kaffa arrived in the harbour, and the authorities who boarded them found scenes of devastation. Dead and dying sailors lay among the cargo, their bodies marked by the telltale signs of plague. The local officials, recognizing some terrible danger, ordered the ships to leave immediately, but it was already too late. The rats that infested every medieval ship had come ashore, and with them their infected fleas. Within days, people in Messina began to sicken and die. There is something deeply tragic about this moment of first contact, this threshold between the world as it was and the world as it would become. The merchants of Kaffa had only sought to escape death, to return to the safety of home. Instead, they became the unwitting agents of death's spread, carrying the plague to every port where they sought refuge. The interconnected world of medieval trade, that marvel of commercial enterprise that had brought such wealth and prosperity, now became the highway for humanity's destroyer. And so the Black Death arrived in Europe, not with the thunder of armies or the proclamations of kings, but quietly, carried in the bodies of desperate sailors and the bloodstreams of obscure fleas. The die was cast, the infection seeded, and now it would spread with a speed and thoroughness that would leave the continent transformed, diminished, traumatized beyond measure. The ships of death had docked, and there would be no turning back. Yet beneath this apparent triumph of the plague over the Mediterranean world, seeds of even greater catastrophe were being sown. The disease, having consumed the south, now turned its attention northward to lands that had seemed for a brief moment as though they might be spared. But this hope was an illusion. There would be no sanctuary, no refuge, no place to hide from what was coming. In June 1348, the plague arrived in England, landing at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. A ship from Gascony, part of England's wine trade with its French territories, brought the infection ashore. Within days, people in the port town began to sicken and die with the now familiar symptoms. The pestilence spread rapidly through the southwest of England, reaching Bristol by August. Bristol, England's second largest city and a major port, became a focal point of devastation. Contemporary accounts speak of grass growing in the streets of Bristol, so few people remained alive or well enough to walk through them. By autumn 1348, the plague had reached London. The capital, home to perhaps 70,000 souls, packed within its walls and overflowing into growing suburbs, was particularly vulnerable. The disease tore through the crowded parishes with merciless efficiency. The wealthy fled to their country estates, but distance provided no real protection. The plague followed them, moving along the roads, carried by travelers and merchants, by beggars and pilgrims. The poor, unable to flee, died in enormous numbers. Entire families were wiped out, entire streets left empty. English chroniclers recorded the catastrophe with numb horror. Henry Knighton wrote of Leicester, where the Jewish community, already small after earlier persecutions, was entirely destroyed. Geoffrey Le Baker described how the plague invaded England with such ferocity that scarcely 1 in 10 of either sex survived. While such estimates might be exaggerated, they capture the psychological reality of living through such devastation. It felt like the end of the world, and for many communities it might as well have been. The plague's geography in England reveals the importance of trade and communication networks. Cities and market towns, connected by roads and rivers, were struck early and hard. More remote rural areas sometimes experienced delays, brief reprieves before the inevitable arrival of death. But the disease found even isolated villages eventually, brought by a traveling merchant, a fleeing refugee, or simply by the rats that thrived wherever humans stored grain. Meanwhile, in continental Europe, the plague continued its northern advance. Germany was invaded in 1348 and 1349, the disease following the Rhine and Danube river valleys, spreading through the great trading cities of the Hanseatic League. Cologne, Frankfurt, Bremen, Hamburg, these prosperous centers of commerce became plague pits. The German lands, fragmented into countless principalities and free cities, lacked any coordinated response. Each locality faced the pestilence in isolation, with varying degrees of panic and competence. Scandinavia received the plague in 1349, brought by ship from England to Norway. From Bergen it spread throughout Norway, then to Sweden and Denmark. Even Iceland did not escape, though it was one of the last places in Europe to be affected. The plague reached into the Arctic reaches of northern Scandinavia, finding Sami communities that had little contact with the wider world, yet still falling victim to the disease. As the pestilence moved north, it encountered different conditions. The colder climate, the lower population density, the different housing structures all affected the plague's spread, yet none stopped it entirely. The disease proved grimly adaptable, finding pathways to transmission regardless of local conditions. In the cold of a Scandinavian winter, the pneumonic form of the plague, spreading directly from person to person, may have played a larger role than in the warmer south. By the end of 1349, nearly all of Western and Northern Europe had been touched by the Black Death. Only a few isolated regions, protected by geography and luck, remained relatively unscathed. Parts of Poland, Belgium and Bohemia experienced lower mortality rates, though historians debate whether this was due to quarantine measures, lower population density, or simply the unpredictable nature of the disease itself. Time, as it often does, had its own terrible rhythm. The plague moved in waves, cresting in one region as it ebbed in another, only to return again months or years later. The initial pandemic of 1347-1353 was merely the first act in a drama that would continue with periodic outbreaks for centuries to come. But in those first years, when the disease was new and its mortality at its highest, when no one understood its nature or how to protect against it, the terror was absolute, and so Europe found itself transformed into a vast landscape of death, from the Mediterranean to the North Sea, from the Atlantic to the borders of Russia. Approximately 1/3 to 1/2 of the population had perished in the span of just a few years. The demographic catastrophe was complete, and now the survivors would have to face the question that haunted every waking moment. What kind of world remained, and how could humanity possibly continue? There is something deeply terrifying about the unknown, about an enemy that cannot be seen or understood. The people of medieval Europe faced precisely such an enemy, and the manner of its killing was as horrifying as anything the human imagination might conjure. To understand the full measure of the Black Death's terror, we must look closely at what it did to the human body. At the stages of suffering its victims endured, the infection typically began innocuously enough, with symptoms that might have been mistaken for any common illness. Victims experienced headache, chills, and general weakness. Perhaps they thought they had caught a cold, or that they were simply overtired from the stress of living in a city gripped by fear. But within a day or two, the true nature of the disease revealed itself with unmistakable clarity. The most characteristic symptom, the one that gave the bubonic plague its name, was the appearance of buboes. These were swellings of the lymph nodes, the body's desperate attempt to contain the infection that was flooding through the lymphatic system. The buboes typically appeared in the groin, armpits, or neck, the areas where lymph nodes are largest and most numerous. They grew with alarming speed, sometimes reaching the size of an egg or even an apple. The pain they caused was excruciating, a deep, throbbing agony that made movement torture. The skin over the buboes became inflamed and discolored, taking on a dark, purplish hue that presaged the blackening that gave the disease its popular name. Accompanying the buboes came fever, intense and unrelenting. Victims burned with heat, their bodies trying desperately to fight an infection they could not defeat. Pulse rates soared, breathing became labored. Many victims experienced intense thirst, but found that drinking provided no relief. Some fell into delirium, raving and hallucinating, recognizing neither family nor surroundings. The fever could be so high that it caused seizures, particularly in children. As the infection progressed, more horrifying symptoms emerged. The bacteria, multiplying exponentially in the bloodstream, released toxins that caused blood vessels to leak and tissues to die. Victims might vomit blood or pass bloody stools. Their skin developed dark patches called purpura, areas where blood had pooled beneath the skin. In the most severe cases, entire fingers, toes, or areas of the face would turn black with gangrene as tissues died from lack of blood flow. This necrosis was the source of one of the plague's most fearsome names, the Black Death. Perhaps most terrifying was the speed with which the disease progressed. From the first appearance of symptoms to death was typically 3 to 7 days in bubonic plague, though some unfortunate souls succumbed within hours. There was no gradual decline, no long period of recuperation. The disease struck like lightning, and most of those it struck did not rise again. The pneumonic form of the plague, which affected the lungs, was even more rapidly fatal. Victims developed severe cough, often bringing up blood-tinged or bloody sputum. Their breathing became increasingly labored as their lungs filled with fluid and pus. The cyanosis, the blue-gray coloring of the skin due to lack of oxygen, added another dimension to the horror. Pneumonic plague victims rarely survived beyond 2 to 3 days from symptom onset, and the mortality rate approached 100% in the absence of modern antibiotics. Contemporary physicians, trained in the medical theories of Galen and Hippocrates, were utterly baffled. They tried their traditional remedies, bloodletting to balance the humours, purging to expel corrupted matter, the application of poultices and herbal preparations to the buboes. Some doctors attempted to lance the buboes, hoping to drain the infection. Occasionally, this might have provided some relief from the pressure and pain, though it did nothing to address the underlying bacterial infection. Most medical interventions were useless at best and harmful at worst, further weakening patients who desperately needed their strength. The psychological impact of these symptoms cannot be overstated. The visible nature of the suffering, the rapid deterioration, the obvious pain, all of this created an atmosphere of absolute terror. Families watched their loved ones transform from healthy individuals to blackened, delirious, dying creatures in the space of a few days. The fear of contagion warred with love and duty. And too often, fear won. Stories circulated of parents abandoning children, spouses fleeing from spouses, the sick left alone to die in rooms bolted from the outside. Yet amidst this horror, there were also acts of profound courage and compassion. Some physicians remained at their posts, tending to the sick, even as they knew they were likely signing their own death warrants. Priests continued to administer last rites, bringing spiritual comfort to the dying. Some family members stayed faithful to the end, nursing their sick through the terrible final days, cleaning their bodies after death with trembling but devoted hands. The disease made no distinctions. Rich and poor, old and young, clergy and laity all fell to the plague with equal facility. A healthy adult might be struck down while an elderly person in the same household survived. This seeming randomness only added to the terror. There was no way to predict who would be taken and who would be spared. No logic to the pattern of death. It felt capricious, almost personal, as though death itself had taken on a malevolent intelligence and was stalking through the streets, choosing victims according to some incomprehensible plan, and so the wheel of fortune turned, and humanity learned anew that flesh is fragile, that life hangs by the finest thread, and that even in the heights of medieval civilization, with its great cathedrals and universities, its codes of chivalry and systems of law, humans remained vulnerable to forces they could neither see nor understand nor control. The symptoms of the plague wrote lessons in pain across countless bodies, lessons about mortality and fragility that would haunt European consciousness for generations to come. But this was only the beginning of a journey into darkness that would test the very fabric of civilization. As the plague took hold in cities across Europe, the normal rhythms of daily life, those routines and rituals that define human existence, began to break down. What emerged was something that resembled ordinary life, only in the most superficial ways. Beneath the surface, society was fracturing, social bonds dissolving, and the thin veneer of civilization cracking to reveal the terror beneath. In the early stages of an outbreak, cities attempted to maintain normalcy. Markets still opened, though fewer merchants came to sell and fewer customers came to buy. Churches still held services, though the congregations grew smaller and more fearful. The wealthy still employed servants, though servants became harder to find and more expensive to retain. But as the death toll mounted, as the plague moved from isolated cases to widespread infection, this facade of normalcy crumbled. The most immediate and visible problem was the sheer number of corpses. In a normal year, death was a familiar but manageable presence in medieval cities. Infant mortality was high, disease and accident claimed their share, and the elderly passed on according to nature's course. But the infrastructure for dealing with the dead, the grave diggers and priests, the cemetery space and funeral rituals, was designed for normal times. The plague produced death on a scale that overwhelmed every system. At first, families tried to maintain traditional funeral practices. The body would be washed and shrouded, taken to the church for a funeral mass, then buried in the churchyard with proper ceremony. But as deaths multiplied, these practices became impossible to sustain. Priests who officiated at funerals and administered last rites were dying at higher rates than the general population due to their close contact with the sick and dying. Their replacements could not be trained fast enough. Graveyards filled to capacity, then beyond. The ground became so saturated with corpses that the smell of decay hung over entire neighborhoods. In desperation, city authorities commandeered fields outside the walls, digging enormous pits where hundreds or thousands of bodies could be buried in mass graves. In these plague pits, bodies were stacked in layers, often without coffins or shrouds, sometimes without any religious ceremony at all. The very thing that medieval Christians most feared, burial in unconsecrated ground, without proper rites, became the fate of countless thousands. The process of removing the dead from homes and streets fell to men who came to be called corpse carriers or bikini. These were often criminals given the choice between serving in this capacity or facing punishment, or desperate poor people willing to risk infection for the wages that no one else would work for. They moved through the streets with carts, calling for people to bring out their dead. The sound of cartwheels and the call, "Bring out your dead," became a signature horror of plague-stricken cities. Bodies were thrown onto the carts with little ceremony, sometimes while the person was not yet fully dead, transported to the plague pits and dumped in. Daily commerce nearly ceased in the worst affected cities. Shops closed, markets emptied. Those merchants who remained open found few customers willing to risk the crowds and contact that shopping required. The fear of contagion permeated every transaction. People avoided touching coins, believing they might carry the pestilence. Some merchants developed systems where coins were placed in bowls of vinegar, thought to have disinfecting properties. Others simply refused to handle money directly, using tongs or requiring payment to be left in a designated spot. Food supplies became precarious. Farmers hesitated to bring produce into plague-infested cities, fearing both infection and the possibility of being quarantined if the city closed its gates. Within cities, bakers and butchers died or fled, leaving fewer sources of essential food. The wealthy, who normally could buy whatever they needed, found that money meant little when there was nothing to purchase and no one willing to serve them. Stories circulated of nobles who starved in their palaces because all their servants had died or run away. The breakdown of normal life extended to every aspect of society. Criminals, seeing that law enforcement had effectively ceased, engaged in looting and robbery with impunity. Houses left empty by death became targets for thieves who stripped them of valuables. Some of these thieves were caught by neighbors and killed on the spot, vigilante justice replacing the legal system. Other criminals simply joined the thousands of people fleeing the cities, hoping to find safety in the countryside. Public sanitation, never robust in medieval cities, collapsed entirely. The people who normally removed refuse and cleaned the streets were dead or fled. Waste piled up in alleys and streets. Dead animals, including the thousands of dogs and cats killed because they were suspected of spreading the plague, rotted where they fell. The stench became unbearable, a physical presence that assaulted anyone who ventured outside. Flies and other vermin multiplied in the filth, adding to the sense of corruption and decay. Yet even in this apocalyptic landscape, some aspects of life continued. Children played in the streets, though their games now included pretending to be plague doctors or acting out funeral processions. Couples married knowing they might have only days together. Women gave birth, bringing new life into a world dominated by death. These acts of ordinary life continued in the face of extraordinary horror, speak to something resilient in the human spirit, some refusal to surrender entirely to despair. And so the cities of Europe became vast stages for a drama of death and survival, where the props were corpse carts and plague pits, where the players were the dying and the desperate, and where the only certain thing was uncertainty. Each day brought fresh horrors, fresh losses, fresh evidence that the world as it had been known was gone forever. Those who survived did so by navigating this nightmare landscape, making impossible choices, compromising deeply held beliefs, and learning to live with a level of death and suffering that no one should have to endure. As the years unfolded like pages in a terrible chronicle, another victim of the plague revealed itself: faith itself. The medieval church, that mighty institution which had shaped European civilization for 1,000 years, which held authority over souls and wielded power over kingdoms, found itself facing a crisis that would shake it to its foundations. The plague challenged not just the church's earthly power, but the very theological framework through which medieval people understood their world. At the outbreak of the pestilence, the church's response was predictable and, within the framework of medieval theology, logical. The plague was understood as divine punishment for sin. God, angered by the corruption and wickedness of humanity, had sent this scourge to chastise the faithful and punish the wicked. The solution, therefore, was repentance, prayer, and penance. If humanity would turn from its sins and beg God's mercy, the plague would be lifted. Across Europe, bishops organized religious processions, mass prayers, and public acts of penance. Thousands gathered in churches and cathedrals to beg God for deliverance. Relics of saints were paraded through plague-stricken streets, their holy power invoked to drive back the pestilence. Special masses were said, prayers recited around the clock. The faithful prostrated themselves before altars, wept, and promised reform if only God would stay his hand. But the plague did not stop. If anything, these mass gatherings, bringing together hundreds or thousands of people in close proximity, may have accelerated the disease's spread. The very acts meant to appease God seemed instead to provoke worse outbreaks. This created a profound theological crisis. If the plague was God's punishment, and if the people had responded with appropriate penance, why did God not relent? What kind of sin could be so great that even the most fervent prayer could not obtain forgiveness? The Church's moral authority suffered a devastating blow as clergy died in enormous numbers. Priests, monks, and nuns, through their duties caring for the sick and administering last rites, exposed themselves repeatedly to infection. In some regions, 40 to 50% of the clergy perished. Monasteries, which had been centers of learning and spirituality for centuries, were devastated. Some lost nearly their entire communities. The survivors, often younger and less well-trained, were rushed into positions of responsibility for which they were unprepared. Worse yet, some clergy responded to the plague not with courage, but with cowardice. Stories spread of priests who fled their parishes, abandoning their flocks in the hour of greatest need. Some demanded exorbitant fees to administer last rites, extorting money from desperate families. Others refused to approach the dying at all, offering prayers only from a distance. These failures, while understandable from a human perspective, were devastating to the Church's image. How could the faithful trust in the spiritual power of men who so clearly feared death as much as anyone else? The theological questions became even more troubling. If God was punishing sin, why did holy men and women die alongside sinners? Why were children innocent of serious sins struck down? Why did some notorious sinners survive while pious believers perished? The seeming randomness of the plague's victims contradicted the doctrine of divine justice. Some theologians argued that God was simply taking the righteous to heaven early, sparing them further suffering in a corrupt world. But this explanation satisfied few when parents buried their children and husbands their wives. Into this vacuum of orthodox religious authority stepped more extreme expressions of faith. The most famous and most disturbing were the flagellants, bands of penitents who wandered from town to town, publicly whipping themselves as penance for humanity's sins. They marched in organized processions, stripped to the waist, beating their backs bloody with leather thongs studded with iron points. They sang hymns and recited prayers, calling on God to show mercy. The flagellants believed that their suffering could atone for the sins that had brought the plague. For 33.5 days, representing the years of Christ's life, they would journey and flagellate, accepting no baths, no change of clothing, and no shelter in houses or inns. The movement spread rapidly across Germany and into surrounding regions, attracting thousands of participants. For a time, they were popular among common people who saw in them a more direct, more authentically Christian response to the crisis than the institutional church was providing. But the flagellants soon became a problem. They began to claim that their penance was more effective than the sacraments administered by priests. Some groups attacked clergy, accusing them of corruption and ineffectiveness. They took over churches for their ceremonies, usurping the authority of local priests. Their processions, like the religious gatherings organized by the church, likely spread the plague further. The movement also took on apocalyptic overtones, with some flagellants preaching that the end of the world was imminent. Pope Clement VI, recognizing the threat to church authority, condemned the flagellant movement in October 1349. He declared it heretical and ordered secular authorities to suppress it. Gradually, the movement was broken up, though it persisted in some areas for years. Yet the fact that it had emerged at all, that thousands of Christians had essentially rejected the institutional church in favor of their own, more extreme practice, revealed how deeply the plague had shaken religious confidence. Other expressions of religious hysteria emerged as well. Some people interpreted the plague as a sign of the apocalypse, the end times prophesied in the book of Revelation. They abandoned their normal lives, gave away their possessions, and waited for Christ's return. Others fell into fatalism and despair, concluding that if God was determined to destroy humanity, there was nothing to be done but await death. This attitude sometimes led to abandonment of moral restraints, with some people engaging in drinking, gambling, and sexual license, reasoning that they might as well enjoy their last days. The Church, struggling to maintain order and authority in the face of these challenges, had to reconsider some of its positions. The chronic shortage of trained clergy led to a relaxation of standards for ordination. Men with less education and questionable vocations were rushed through training and given positions that would have been closed to them in normal times. This contributed to a decline in the overall quality of the clergy, a problem that would persist and eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation. And in this moment of spiritual crisis, we glimpse something profound about the human need for meaning in the face of suffering. When the answers provided by established religion no longer sufficed, people sought other explanations, other solutions. Some turned to more extreme piety, others to heresy, and still others to a desperate search for scapegoats who could be blamed for God's anger. This search for someone to blame would have consequences as terrible as the plague itself, consequences that revealed the darkest capacities of the human heart. Meanwhile, in the corridors of human cruelty, a tragedy within the tragedy was unfolding. The plague, terrible enough in its own right, provided the context for one of medieval Europe's darkest hours. In the desperate search for explanations, for someone to blame, for some human agency that could be punished and stopped, European communities turned on those who had long been marginalized and suspected, the Jews, along with other outsiders like lepers, foreigners, and beggars. The accusations began with rumors, whispers exchanged in markets and taverns. The plague was not natural, some said, but a deliberate plot. The Jews, denied access to most professions and forced into money lending and trade, had supposedly poisoned the wells and springs from which Christians drew their water. This explained, to minds desperate for explanation, why the plague had come and why it spread so unpredictably. That this theory made no logical sense, Jews themselves died of the plague in equal proportion to Christians, did not diminish its power over frightened, angry populations. The myth of well poisoning had a long history in medieval Europe, surfacing during earlier epidemics and famines. But the scale and intensity of the Black Death gave it new life and terrible consequences. In some communities, Jewish residents were rounded up and tortured until they confessed to poisoning wells. These forced confessions, extracted under unimaginable pain, were then used to justify further violence against Jews in other cities. The confessions became self-perpetuating proof of a vast conspiracy. The violence began in earnest in the spring and summer of 1348 in southern France and spread rapidly. In Toulon, the Jewish quarter was sacked and its inhabitants killed. In Strasbourg, despite the city council's initial attempts to protect the Jewish community, pressure from guilds and the mob resulted in the massacre of several thousand Jews in February 1349, and they were gathered in a wooden building in the Jewish cemetery and burned alive. The property of the murdered Jews was seized, debts owed to Jewish moneylenders were cancelled, and the city council that had tried to protect them was overthrown. The pattern repeated itself across Europe. In Mainz, despite a courageous attempt by the Jewish community to defend themselves, 6,000 Jews were killed. In Cologne, Jews were murdered before the plague even reached the city, preemptive violence based on fear and rumor. In Basel, Jews were locked in wooden buildings and burned. Some communities saw their entire Jewish populations exterminated. In regions of Germany and France, centuries-old Jewish communities were destroyed in a matter of weeks. Some authorities attempted to resist the madness. Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls in 1348 condemning the violence and pointing out the logical flaws in the poisoning theory. He noted that Jews were dying of the plague in equal numbers and that the disease had struck regions where there were no Jews at all. Some local rulers tried to protect their Jewish subjects, recognizing both the injustice and the economic damage that losing Jewish merchants and financiers would cause. But popular fury, stoked by fear and economic resentment, often overwhelmed these protective efforts. The motivations behind the violence were complex and went beyond simple scapegoating. Economic factors played a significant role. Many Christians owed debts to Jewish moneylenders, one of the few professions open to Jews in medieval society. Killing the Jews and seizing their property had the convenient effect of cancelling these debts. The plague also created economic upheaval that left many people desperate and angry, emotions that sought an outlet. Religious prejudice, carefully cultivated over centuries by church teachings that portrayed Jews as Christ killers and enemies of Christianity, provided the ideological framework for violence. The persecution extended beyond Jews. Lepers, already ostracized and confined to lazar houses, were accused of spreading the disease deliberately or of being in league with Jews and Muslims in a vast conspiracy. Some lepers were killed, their settlements burned. Foreign merchants, particularly those from regions already affected by the plague, faced suspicion and violence. Beggars and pilgrims traveling through plague-stricken regions were sometimes driven away from towns or killed for fear they carried infection. This wave of violence represented a profound moral failure of medieval Christian society. At the very moment when compassion and solidarity were most needed, many communities instead turned to hatred and murder. The rhetoric of Christian charity, so central to medieval religious life, proved hollow when tested by crisis. The plague revealed not only the fragility of the human body, but also the fragility of human civilization itself, showing how quickly social order could collapse into barbarism. Some Jews fled to regions that offered better protection. Poland, under King Casimir III, became a refuge for Jewish refugees from Western Europe. The king protected his Jewish subjects, recognizing their value to his kingdom's economy. This would have long-term consequences for European Jewish demographics, with Poland becoming home to the largest Jewish population in Europe. But for those who remained in Western Europe, the Black Death era marked a catastrophic turning point. Many communities never recovered their former size or prosperity. There is something deeply shameful about this chapter of the Black Death story, this revelation that human cruelty could flourish even amidst universal suffering. The plague killed without discrimination, yet humans facing this universal threat chose to create divisions, to identify enemies, to commit atrocities that added human evil to natural disaster. Perhaps what endures from this dark time is not just the memory of disease, but also the reminder of how easily fear can be transmuted into hatred, how readily societies can abandon their professed values when tested by crisis. History remembers the plague, but we must also remember its victims, not just those who died of disease, but those who were murdered by their neighbors, those who suffered twice, once from the pestilence that ravaged their bodies, and again from the human hatred that destroyed their communities. In their memory lies a warning that echoes across the centuries, a reminder that the real plague, the one that truly threatens humanity's survival, may not be disease but rather the impulse to respond to fear with violence, to seek simple answers to complex problems, and to abandon compassion precisely when it is most needed. There comes a moment in the telling of any great catastrophe when we must pause and attempt to grasp the sheer magnitude of what occurred. Numbers, cold and abstract as they are, sometimes capture truths that narrative cannot fully convey. And the numbers of the Black Death are staggering, almost beyond human comprehension, representing a loss of life so vast that it reshaped the demographic landscape of an entire continent. Before the plague arrived, Europe's population had been growing steadily for 3 centuries. From perhaps 50 million souls in the year 1000, it had expanded to somewhere between 75 and 80 million by 1340. This growth represented agricultural expansion, relative peace in many regions, and improving living conditions. Cities had flourished, trade had expanded, and Europe stood at a kind of medieval zenith. Then came the Black Death, and in the span of just 5 years, roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of that population was gone. The precise mortality rate varied dramatically by region and locality. Some areas, particularly in Italy and southern France, may have lost 60 to 70% of their populations. Florence, that jewel of Renaissance culture, saw its population plummet from perhaps 120,000 before the plague to 50,000 afterward. Venice lost 60% of its inhabitants. In Tuscany as a whole, contemporary estimates suggest the population declined from 2 million to 800,000. The great cities of northern Europe suffered similarly catastrophic losses. Paris may have lost half its population, London perhaps 40,000 of its 70,000 inhabitants. Rural areas, though sometimes spared the worst of the plague's fury, still experienced devastating losses. Entire villages were abandoned, their fields left untilled, their churches standing empty. In England, surveys conducted after the plague identified hundreds of deserted settlements. The medieval landscape was dotted with these ghost villages, silent testimony to communities that had simply ceased to exist. The survivors sometimes relocated to better land left vacant by the dead, creating a wholesale reorganization of settlement patterns. Yet numbers alone cannot capture the human dimension of this catastrophe. Behind every statistic was a person who had lived and loved, who had dreams and fears, who mattered to someone. Families were destroyed, entire lineages extinguished. Children found themselves orphaned, parents bereaved of all their offspring. The emotional and psychological trauma was immeasurable. Those who survived did so with the memory of watching most of the people they knew die in agony, of disposing of corpses, of living through months of constant terror and grief. The demographic impact extended beyond the immediate death toll. The plague disrupted marriage patterns and fertility for years afterward. Many young people died before they could marry and have children, reducing the next generation's size. The psychological trauma and economic disruption delayed marriages among survivors. When the plague was at its height, weddings and christenings virtually ceased as communities focused simply on survival. Birth rates plummeted during the pandemic and remained suppressed for years. The age structure of the population was also affected, though not in the way one might expect. While the very young and very old typically suffered higher mortality in most diseases, the Black Death seemed to strike with relative equality across age groups. This meant that the loss of young adults, those in their most productive years, was particularly severe. The demographic pyramid that had been expanding at its base suddenly became irregular, with entire cohorts partially or largely eliminated. The nobility and clergy, despite their often better living conditions, were not spared. Kings and princes died of the plague. Alfonso V of Castile died during the siege of Gibraltar in 1350. Joan, daughter of King Edward III of England, died of plague in 1348 while travelling to marry Prince Peter of Castile. The Archbishop of Canterbury, John Stratford, died in 1348, and his successor, Thomas Bradwardine, died of plague within a year of his appointment. The mortality among the aristocracy, while probably somewhat lower than among the general population, was still devastating and led to complex succession disputes as multiple heirs died in quick succession. The intellectual and cultural loss was incalculable. Universities lost students and masters. Monasteries, which had been centers of learning and manuscript production, saw their scriptoria fall silent as monks died. Artisans and craftsmen whose skills had been acquired through years of apprenticeship died before they could pass their knowledge to the next generation. Some crafts and techniques were lost entirely, their secrets dying with their last practitioner. Attempts to calculate the exact death toll have occupied historians for generations. Parish records, tax rolls, and contemporary chronicles provide fragmentary evidence, but comprehensive data does not exist. Modern historians generally agree that Europe lost between 30 and 50% of its population, with the consensus settling around 40% as the most likely figure. This would mean that of perhaps 75 million people alive in 1347, only 45 million remained by 1353. 30 million souls vanished in half a decade. To put this in perspective, imagine if a catastrophe today killed 40% of your country's population in 5 years. Not just the elderly, not just the sick, but people of all ages and conditions. Imagine watching 2 out of every 5 people you know die. Imagine cities half empty, businesses closed, schools shuttered, entire neighborhoods abandoned. This is what Europe experienced, and the trauma of it would echo through generations. The demographic recovery was slow and uneven. It would take more than a century for Europe's population to return to pre-plague levels, and in some regions, recovery took even longer. The recurrence of plague in subsequent decades and the social and economic disruptions that followed the initial pandemic impeded rapid recovery. Some scholars argue that Europe did not fully recover demographically until the 16th century, nearly 200 years after the Black Death's first appearance. Yet perhaps what endures most powerfully is not the statistical measure, but the human reality behind it. The Black Death was not an abstraction, but an intimate tragedy repeated millions of times over. Each death represented a world destroyed, a network of relationships severed, a future cancelled. The survivors carried this weight of loss with them, a collective trauma that shaped how they saw the world, how they understood their place in it, and how they rebuilt the civilization that remained. In the counting of the dead, we must remember that we count not just numbers but lives, not just statistics but stories, each one precious, each one mourned, each one a universe unto itself, now forever silent. As one chapter closed in the charnel houses and plague pits of Europe, another, unexpected and revolutionary, began to open. The massive mortality caused by the Black Death did not simply leave Europe as a smaller version of what it had been. Instead, the pandemic triggered a cascade of economic and social changes that fundamentally transformed medieval civilization, creating the conditions for the end of the Middle Ages and the emergence of a new world. The most immediate and dramatic impact was on labor. Before the plague, Europe's large population had created a surplus of workers. Land was scarce, wages were low, and laborers had little bargaining power. Peasants, bound to their lords' estates by feudal obligations, had few options for improving their condition. But when half the population died, this equation reversed with shocking speed. Suddenly labor was scarce and land was abundant. The balance of power between workers and employers, between peasants and lords, shifted fundamentally. Surviving peasants and laborers found themselves in unprecedented demand. Lords who had previously relied on an abundant supply of unfree labor now competed desperately for workers to till their fields and tend their livestock. Wages for agricultural and urban labor soared. In England, the daily wage for a farm laborer approximately doubled in the decade after the plague. Skilled craftsmen commanded even higher premiums. Workers who had previously accepted whatever terms were offered now could negotiate, demand better conditions, higher pay, or simply pack up and move to a lord who offered better terms. The nobility and wealthy urban patricians viewed these developments with alarm and anger. Accustomed to deferential, cheap labor, they found themselves facing demands and even ultimatums from people they considered their social inferiors. Their first response was to try to legislate away the new economic reality. England passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, attempting to fix wages at pre-plague levels and restrict workers' mobility. Similar laws were enacted across Europe. But economic forces proved stronger than legislation. Employers desperate for workers paid above the legal maximum. Workers moved despite restrictions. The laws were widely evaded and ultimately failed to halt wage increases. The flood of inheritance money created other economic effects. With so many dead, property and wealth concentrated in fewer hands, many survivors found themselves inheriting from relatives they had barely known. Younger sons, who under normal circumstances would have expected little inheritance, suddenly became wealthy as older brothers died. Women, particularly widows, sometimes inherited significant estates. This redistribution of wealth created new opportunities for social mobility. Merchants could afford to purchase minor noble titles. Successful craftsmen became substantial property owners. The abundance of land relative to population led to a shift in agricultural practices. Marginal farmland, the less productive fields that had been pressed into service during the population boom, was abandoned. Cultivation concentrated on better soil. In many areas, there was a shift from labor-intensive grain cultivation to less labor-demanding animal husbandry. Sheep farming, particularly for wool production, expanded dramatically in England and other regions. These changes improved productivity for those who remained, Even as total production declined, urban life was transformed as well. Cities had lost much of their population, but those who remained or who migrated from the countryside found new opportunities. Guilds, those carefully regulated associations of craftsmen, had to adapt to labor shortages. Apprenticeship periods were shortened. Entry requirements were relaxed. Some trades that had been closed to newcomers were forced to accept them. The urban labor market became more fluid, more competitive, and ultimately more dynamic. The relationship between lords and peasants underwent fundamental change. Serfdom, that system by which peasants were bound to the land and subject to their lord's authority, began to break down. Why would a peasant accept servile status when he could run away to a neighboring estate or a city and find better conditions? Lords found it more practical to rent land for cash payment than to rely on unfree labor services that workers resented and performed poorly. Gradually, across Western Europe, serfdom declined and was replaced by various forms of wage labor or tenant farming. This process took decades or even centuries to complete, but the Black Death was its catalyst. This economic transformation bred social tension and sometimes violence. The peasants and workers, having tasted improved conditions, resisted attempts to push them back into their former subordination. The nobility and urban oligarchs, seeing their power and privilege threatened, reacted with legislation, intimidation, and sometimes violence. This tension exploded in a series of popular revolts in the late 14th century. The French Jacquerie of 1358, though partly caused by other factors, reflected the social stresses of the post-plague world. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was explicitly driven by attempts to suppress wages and reimpose feudal obligations. Though these revolts were crushed, they demonstrated that the old order could not be simply restored by force. Women's economic position also shifted, though in complex and sometimes contradictory ways. The labor shortage opened some occupations to women that had previously been male-dominated. Widows, inheriting their husbands' businesses or property, sometimes became independent economic actors. In guilds and trades, women gained slightly greater acceptance, though they still faced significant discrimination. Yet, as labor became more valuable, there was also pressure for women to marry and bear children to replenish the population, which could limit their autonomy in other ways. The church, as a major landowner and employer, faced the same economic pressures as secular lords. It struggled to maintain its estates and collect its revenues as labor became expensive and peasants more independent. The economic difficulties contributed to the decline in the church's power and prestige that had begun with its failure to halt the plague or explain it satisfactorily. Some monasteries and religious houses, having lost most of their members, were abandoned or consolidated with others, and so the wheel of fortune turned, bringing unexpected consequences to the plague's devastation. The catastrophe that had destroyed so many lives paradoxically improved the material conditions of many who survived. The rigid hierarchies of medieval society loosened, creating space for social mobility and economic dynamism. The changes were not universal or immediate, and they came at a terrible cost, but they were real and profound. The world that emerged from the Black Death was fundamentally different from the world that had entered it, transformed not by planning or revolution, but by the unintended consequences of demographic catastrophe. Medieval society, already stressed by other factors, had been pushed past a breaking point, and what arose from the ruins was something new, something that would eventually lead to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the modern world. Yet beneath this apparent transformation of the social and economic order, seeds of renewed terror were germinating. For those who survived the initial pandemic and began to rebuild their lives, there must have been a hope, perhaps even an expectation, that the worst was over. They had endured the unendurable, survived the unsurvivable, and now surely life could return to some semblance of normalcy. But history had other lessons to teach, darker truths to reveal. The Black Death had not finished with Europe. It would return again and again, each recurrence bringing fresh grief and reinforcing the trauma. The second major outbreak came in 1361, just 8 years after the initial pandemic had subsided. This wave, sometimes called the pestis secunda, or children's plague, struck Europe with renewed fury. While perhaps not as devastating as the first pandemic in terms of overall mortality, it was particularly lethal to children and young people who had been born after the first wave and thus had no immunity. For parents who had survived the first plague, often at the cost of losing siblings, friends, and their own parents, this second wave brought a new kind of agony, watching their children die of the same disease that had haunted their own youth. The demographic impact of this second wave was significant not just in numbers but in structure. The loss of children meant the loss of the next generation, further delaying Europe's demographic recovery. Young people who survived childhood found themselves entering adulthood in a world where death could return at any moment, where building a future felt uncertain and precarious. This contributed to a shift in medieval mentality, a sense that life was fragile and uncertain, that planning for the long term was perhaps futile. The plague returned again in 1369 and then repeatedly through the 1370s, 1380s and 1390s. No decade of the late 14th century was free from plague somewhere in Europe. The disease seemed to have become endemic, settling into a pattern of periodic eruptions that would last for centuries. Each outbreak was smaller than the Great Pandemic of 1347-1353, but each brought disruption, death, and renewed fear. Communities that had just begun to recover would be struck again, their progress erased, their populations reduced once more. These recurrences followed certain patterns. The plague often struck cities more severely than rural areas, feeding on urban density and the constant movement of people and goods through commercial centers. Port cities, with their rats and their connections to other regions, were particularly vulnerable. The disease sometimes seemed to skip regions in one outbreak only to strike them in the next, creating an unpredictable geography of death that made it impossible to identify truly safe areas. The seasonal pattern of outbreaks became clearer over time. The plague typically arrived in late spring or summer and subsided with cold weather, only to return the following year. This seasonal rhythm was due to the ecology of fleas and rats, which were most active in warm months. Medieval people, not understanding the disease's transmission mechanism, noticed the seasonal pattern but could not explain it. Some attributed it to astrological influences, others to seasonal changes in air quality or humors. The economic and social changes triggered by the initial pandemic were reinforced and sometimes complicated by these recurrences. Each outbreak disrupted labor markets, interrupted commerce, and prevented demographic recovery. The labor shortage that had initially benefited surviving workers persisted because the population could not grow consistently. This extended the period of high wages and social fluidity that characterized the post-Black Death era. Lords and employers never regained the advantage they had held before 1347. The recurrences also affected how people thought about and responded to plague. The first pandemic had caught Europe unprepared, with no understanding of contagion and no effective responses. But as the disease returned repeatedly, certain patterns emerged in how communities tried to protect themselves. Quarantine practices developed, particularly in Italian cities. Ships from infected ports might be required to wait at anchor for 40 days, 40 giorni in Italian, giving us the word quarantine, before being allowed to dock. Cities might close their gates during outbreaks, preventing entry or exit. These measures had mixed effectiveness. They sometimes slowed the plague's spread, but they could not stop it entirely. The disease had too many pathways, both understood and mysterious. A city might seal its gates only to find the plague emerging from within brought by rats that recognized no human barriers. Still, the development of public health measures, crude as they were, represented a significant shift. Communities were learning, slowly and painfully, that collective action could provide some protection against epidemic disease. The cultural and artistic responses to the plague also deepened with the recurrences. The first pandemic had produced immediate reactions, chronicles of horror, prayers for deliverance, the flagellant movement. But as the plague became a recurring feature of European life, it seeped more deeply into cultural consciousness. Art and literature began to reflect a preoccupation with death and mortality that would characterize the late medieval period. The dance of death, or danse macabre, emerged as an artistic motif, showing skeletons leading people of all social ranks in a dance toward death. These images, painted on church walls and illustrated in manuscripts, reminded viewers that death came for everyone, regardless of wealth or status. They reflected both the democratic nature of plague mortality and a kind of dark fatalism about the human condition. Life was fleeting, death was certain, and no earthly distinction mattered in the end. Literature, too, absorbed the plague experience. Boccaccio's Decameron, written during the first pandemic, remained influential, but later works showed how the plague had become part of the mental landscape. Chaucer, writing in England in the latter part of the 14th century, makes references to plague that his audience would have immediately understood. The disease had become a metaphor, a symbol, a shorthand for mortality and divine judgment that needed no explanation. By the early 15th century, Europe had lived with recurring plague for more than 50 years. An entire generation had been born, grown to adulthood, and begun to age without knowing a world free from the periodic threat of pandemic. The plague shaped their worldview, their priorities, their sense of what was important. It contributed to both a certain fatalism, a sense that death could come at any moment and planning for the future was vain, and also to a carpe diem philosophy, an impulse to seize pleasure and opportunity while they lasted. Time, as it often does, had its own cruel rhythm. The plague would continue to recur in Europe for centuries, with major outbreaks in the 16th and 17th centuries and persisting in some areas into the 18th century. But the era of most frequent and deadly recurrences was the century following the Black Death, from 1347 to roughly 1450. This period saw European civilization fundamentally reshaped, not just by the initial catastrophe, but by the continuing pressure of repeated outbreaks that prevented recovery and forced constant adaptation. And so, Europe learned to live with plague, much as later generations would learn to live with other endemic diseases. The terror never entirely faded. Each new outbreak brought fresh panic, but it became familiar, a known enemy rather than an incomprehensible catastrophe. Communities developed coping mechanisms, both practical and psychological. The plague became part of the rhythm of life, a dark thread woven through the fabric of existence, always present, sometimes dormant, occasionally erupting into view to remind humanity of its vulnerability and mortality. The world had changed irreversibly, and those who inhabited it had changed too, shaped by the repeated encounter with death into something harder, more pragmatic, and in some ways more modern than the civilization that had existed before the ships of death first docked in Kaffa's harbor. There comes a moment in the life of any civilization when the old ways, the structures and beliefs that had seemed eternal, suddenly reveal themselves as fragile and temporary. For medieval Europe, the Black Death was that moment. What died in the plague years was not just millions of individuals, but an entire worldview, a whole way of organizing society and understanding existence. The world that emerged from the catastrophe was recognizably different, and the seeds of modernity were planted in the ruin. The feudal system, that intricate web of obligations and loyalties that had structured European society for centuries, began its slow but inexorable collapse. The fundamental premise of feudalism had been that lords provided protection and land in exchange for labor and military service from their vassals and peasants. But when labor became scarce and workers could negotiate their terms, this vertical hierarchy of obligation weakened. Peasants became wage laborers or tenant farmers, free to move and negotiate. The personal bonds of feudal obligation gave way to impersonal economic relationships based on money rather than service. The decline of feudalism was not immediate or uniform. In some regions, particularly in Eastern Europe, lords responded to the labor shortage by tightening their control over peasants, leading to what historians called the Second Serfdom. But in Western Europe, the trend was clearly toward greater freedom for the laboring classes. The centuries-long process of commercialization and urbanization, already underway before the plague, accelerated dramatically. Land became a commodity to be bought and sold rather than a sacred trust passed down through generations. Labor became a market transaction rather than a feudal obligation. The church, which had been the supreme spiritual and intellectual authority of medieval Europe, emerged from the Black Death weakened and questioned. Its failure to stop the plague or even adequately explain it had shaken faith in its spiritual power. The high mortality among clergy, combined with the rapid ordination of less qualified replacements, lowered the overall quality and prestige of the priesthood. The church's wealth and land holdings, which had seemed unassailable, now appeared vulnerable as labor shortages made estates difficult to manage and revenues declined. More profoundly, the plague had shaken theological certainties. The medieval worldview had portrayed the universe as an ordered hierarchy, with God at the apex and everything else arranged according to divine plan. But the randomness of plague mortality, the suffering of the innocent, the survival of the wicked, all of this contradicted the notion of a just and comprehensible divine order. While most people remained Christian, there was no alternative framework for understanding the world. Their faith was tempered with doubt and questioning that would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation. The psychological impact of the plague cannot be overstated. An entire generation had grown up surrounded by death, had watched loved ones die in agony, had lived with constant fear and uncertainty. This trauma expressed itself in various ways. There was a heightened awareness of mortality, a preoccupation with death visible in art, literature, and popular culture. The memento mori tradition, remember you must die, became increasingly prominent. Tombs were decorated with images of decomposing corpses. Art depicted death as a grinning skeleton coming for everyone, rich and poor alike. But alongside this morbidity came its opposite, a fierce embrace of life and pleasure. Having seen how quickly life could be extinguished, many people determined to enjoy it while they could. This attitude manifested in increased spending on luxuries, investment in art and culture, and a certain rejection of ascetic religious ideals in favor of worldly enjoyment. The Renaissance, which began in Italy in the decades after the Black Death, was in some ways a reaction to the plague, an affirmation of human creativity and achievement in the face of mortality. The demographic catastrophe created opportunities for innovation and change that might not have existed otherwise. With labor expensive, there was increased incentive to develop labor-saving technology. The period after the Black Death saw improvements in agricultural equipment, the expansion of water and windmills, and innovations in manufacturing. The printing press, invented in the mid-15th century, might have been less revolutionary in a world where labor was cheap and scribes were abundant. Education and literacy expanded, partly because the plague had killed so many of the clergy and educated classes that there was demand for replacements. Universities grew, and education became slightly more accessible to people of middling rank. The monopoly on learning that the church and nobility had enjoyed began to loosen. Vernacular languages gained prestige relative to Latin as literature in French, English, Italian, and other languages flourished. The political landscape shifted as well. The great kingdoms of England and France, exhausted by the 100 Years' War and weakened by plague, began the slow process of centralizing power and building more effective state bureaucracies. Smaller feudal lordships became less viable in an economy that rewarded larger-scale organization. The plague thus contributed indirectly to the rise of the nation-state that would characterize early modern Europe. Trade and commerce, though initially disrupted by the plague, eventually benefited from the new economic realities. With higher wages, surviving workers had more purchasing power. Merchants who survived found opportunities in the reorganized economy. Italian cities, particularly Florence and Venice, grew wealthy despite their losses. The commercial revolution that had begun before the plague accelerated afterward, creating the conditions for European expansion and the age of exploration. Medicine, having failed so spectacularly during the plague, began a slow evolution. The experience revealed the inadequacy of traditional Galenic medicine and its theories of humors. Some physicians began to question ancient authorities and advocate for observation and experiment. The concept of contagion, though still poorly understood, gained acceptance. Public health measures, primitive as they were, represented a new approach to disease management. These changes were gradual, and medicine would remain largely ineffective for centuries, but the seeds of the scientific medical revolution were planted. The plague also affected European demographics in subtle ways that would have long-term consequences. The population decline made land and resources relatively more abundant, raising living standards. When population did eventually recover, it did so in a context of better nutrition and housing, higher wages, and greater personal freedom. Some historians argue that this helped create the conditions for the economic dynamism that would eventually lead to the Industrial Revolution. Perhaps most profoundly, the Black Death altered the medieval sense of security and permanence. Before the plague, despite wars and local disasters, there had been a sense that the social order was stable, that God's plan was unfolding according to predictable patterns. The plague shattered this illusion. It revealed that everything, kingdoms, cities, families, the church itself, could be destroyed with terrible speed. This realization contributed to a shift from a medieval worldview focused on eternal truths and fixed hierarchies to a more modern sensibility that accepted change, uncertainty, and human agency. And in this moment of transformation, we glimpse something profound about how civilizations evolve. Change rarely comes from conscious design or gradual reform. More often, it is catastrophe that breaks apart the old order and creates space for the new. The Black Death did not intend to end the Middle Ages or birth the modern world, but it did. Out of the greatest tragedy of medieval civilization came the seeds of what would replace it. The plague was not just an ending, but also a beginning, the terrible midwife of a new age. As the years unfolded like pages in a forgotten manuscript, the Black Death passed from living memory into history and legend. The plague continued to recur in Europe for centuries, with major outbreaks in London in 1665, Marseille in 1720, and smaller ones into the 19th century. But gradually, as public health improved and living conditions changed, the disease retreated from Western Europe. By the mid-19th century, it seemed like a medieval nightmare, terrible but safely in the past. Then the plague returned, in a new form, and with it came the key to understanding what had terrorized humanity for so long. The third pandemic, as historians call it, began in China's Yunnan province in the 1850s. The disease spread along trade routes, reaching Hong Kong in 1894, where it erupted in a major outbreak. This time, however, the plague encountered not medieval mysticism, but modern science. In Hong Kong, two researchers working independently made discoveries that would finally solve the centuries-old mystery of the Black Death's cause. Alexandre Yersin, a Swiss-French bacteriologist working for the Pasteur Institute, arrived in Hong Kong in June 1894. Working in a makeshift laboratory, he obtained samples from the buboes of plague victims and from dead rats found near infected houses. Using a microscope and the bacteriological techniques recently developed by Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, Yersin identified a previously unknown bacterium that was present in both the human and rat samples. He cultured the organism and proved that it was the causative agent of plague. Simultaneously, the Japanese bacteriologist Kitasato Shibasaburo, a student of Robert Koch, was conducting similar research in Hong Kong. Both scientists published their findings, though there was initial controversy about whose discovery was valid. Eventually, Yersin's work was confirmed, and in 1967, the bacterium was officially named Yersinia pestis in his honor. The identification of the bacterium was a crucial breakthrough, but it left unanswered the question of how the disease spread. The answer came from Paul Louis Simond, another French researcher working in British India. In 1898, Simond demonstrated that plague was primarily a disease of rats, transmitted to humans by fleas. He showed that infected fleas, particularly the species Xenopsilla chiopes, could carry the bacteria from rats to humans. When a flea bit an infected rat, the bacteria multiplied in the flea's digestive system, sometimes blocking it entirely. When such a blocked flea attempted to feed on another host, it would regurgitate bacteria into the bite wound, transmitting the infection. This discovery explained many puzzling features of historical plague outbreaks. It clarified why the disease seemed to spread in waves, following the life cycles and migration patterns of rats and fleas. It explained the seasonal pattern as flea populations peaked in warm months. It revealed why port cities were particularly vulnerable. Rats infested ships and spread the disease along trade routes. The medieval observation that plague often began among the poor, who lived in more crowded conditions with greater rat infestation, now made sense. Understanding the disease's transmission mechanism also illuminated why medieval attempts to combat plague had been so ineffective. Quarantine and social distancing could slow human-to-human transmission of the pneumonic form, but they did nothing about the rats and fleas that were the primary vectors. The medieval practice of killing dogs and cats, suspected of spreading disease, was counterproductive since these animals preyed on rats. The flight of wealthy people from cities sometimes helped them avoid infection, but mainly because it removed them from areas of high rat density rather than because of any understanding of contagion. Modern research has revealed even more about Yersinia pestis. Genetic studies have traced the bacterium's evolution and spread. DNA extracted from the teeth of plague victims buried in medieval mass graves has confirmed that Y. pestis was indeed the cause of the Black Death, settling a debate that had persisted despite the historical evidence. Different strains of the bacterium have been identified, and researchers have tracked how it evolved and spread along ancient trade routes from Central Asia to Europe. Scientists have also identified the 3 clinical forms of plague that medieval people experienced without understanding. Bubonic plague, the most common form, occurs when bacteria from a flea bite spread to the lymph nodes, causing the characteristic buboes. Septicemic plague occurs when bacteria enter the bloodstream directly, causing rapid systemic infection without buboes. Pneumonic plague, the most deadly and the only form that spreads directly between humans, occurs when bacteria infect the lungs. Medieval physicians observed these different presentations but could not explain why the same disease manifested in different ways. Modern medicine has also developed effective treatments. Antibiotics such as streptomycin, gentamicin, and doxycycline can cure plague if administered early enough. With prompt treatment, mortality from bubonic plague can be reduced to around 10% compared to the 60 to 90% mortality of untreated cases. Even pneumonic plague, nearly always fatal in medieval times, can be treated successfully if caught within the first day of symptoms. Yet Yersinia pestis has not been conquered entirely. The bacterium still exists in rodent populations in many parts of the world, including the Western United States, Central Asia, and parts of Africa and South America. Several thousand cases of plague are reported annually worldwide, mostly in rural areas where humans come into contact with infected rodents. Occasionally, pneumonic plague outbreaks occur, as in Madagascar in 2017. Modern surveillance and rapid antibiotic treatment prevent these from becoming epidemics, but they remind us that the plague remains a threat. The scientific understanding of the Black Death has allowed historians to reassess the medieval pandemic with new insights. We now know that the high mortality was not mysterious divine judgment, but the result of an evolved pathogen encountering a naive population with no immunity, facilitated by poor living conditions, lack of sanitation, and urban crowding. The different mortality rates in different regions can be partially explained by variations in rat species, flea populations, climate, and population density. This scientific knowledge has not diminished the Black Death's historical significance. If anything, understanding the biological mechanism makes the pandemic more remarkable, not less. Medieval people faced a devastating disease without any of the tools we take for granted. No understanding of bacteria, no antibiotics, no effective public health measures, no vaccines, no way even to see the microbe that was killing them. They confronted this enemy with courage, superstition, and desperation, developing such responses as they could with the knowledge available to them. There is something deeply moving about how science finally solved this ancient mystery. Researchers, working in the twilight of the 19th century, armed with microscopes and the new science of bacteriology, succeeded where centuries of medieval and early modern physicians had failed. They gave us not just the name of humanity's ancient enemy, but the tools to fight it. They transformed the Black Death from an inexplicable catastrophe into an understandable phenomenon, terrible still, but no longer incomprehensible. And in doing so, they demonstrated the power of scientific inquiry to illuminate even the darkest corners of human history. And so the wheel of fortune completes its turn, and we stand at the end of our journey through one of history's darkest hours, yet we find that the journey is not truly over. The Black Death, though it occurred nearly 7 centuries ago, has never really left us. Its echoes reverberate through time, shaping the world we inhabit in ways both obvious and subtle, reminding us of truths about human existence that each generation must learn anew. The demographic impact of the Black Death shaped European population patterns for centuries. The recovery was slow and uneven, and when population did return to pre-plague levels in the 16th century, it did so in a transformed social and economic context. The areas that had been most severely affected, Italy, southern France, Spain, saw their relative importance in European affairs decline, while regions that had suffered less, particularly England and the Netherlands, emerged stronger. These shifts in demographic and economic power helped determine which nations would lead the age of exploration and colonization. The cultural legacy of the plague is perhaps even more pervasive. The late medieval and early Renaissance preoccupation with death and mortality, visible in art, literature, and architecture, was a direct response to the Black Death experience. The danse macabre, the ars moriendi literature teaching people how to die well, the elaborate tomb sculptures showing decomposing corpses, all reflected a society deeply marked by mass death. This sensibility persisted even as the plague became less frequent, shaping European culture's distinctive awareness of mortality. The plague influenced language itself. The word quarantine comes from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days, the period ships from infected ports had to wait before docking. Cordon sanitaire, a line preventing movement in or out of an infected area, emerged from plague control measures. Even the phrase "bless you" after a sneeze may derive from the plague era, when respiratory symptoms could signal the start of deadly illness. These linguistic fossils preserve the memory of the pandemic in our everyday speech. The Black Death's impact on Western thought and philosophy was profound. The experience of seemingly random, inexplicable suffering on such a massive scale challenged religious and philosophical frameworks. It contributed to a gradual shift from medieval certainties about divine order to a more questioning, skeptical stance that would eventually help produce the Enlightenment. The plague forced people to confront the fragility of existence and the limits of human understanding, questions that philosophers and theologians grapple with still. In medical history, the Black Death stands as both a warning and an inspiration. It demonstrated humanity's vulnerability to infectious disease, a lesson that has had to be relearned periodically. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-1919, which killed tens of millions, showed that even modern medicine could be overwhelmed by a novel pathogen. The HIV/AIDS pandemic, the SARS outbreak, the Ebola epidemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, each has reminded us that infectious disease remains a threat despite our technological advances. Yet the contrast between medieval helplessness and modern medicine's response to disease is also instructive. When COVID-19 emerged in 2019, scientists identified the pathogen within weeks, sequenced its genome, and developed effective vaccines within a year. The death toll, while tragic, was a tiny fraction of what it would have been with medieval technology. This demonstrates how far humanity has come, but also how much the experience of plague, the fear, the social disruption, the economic impact remains recognizable across centuries. The Black Death also taught lessons about social resilience and breakdown that remain relevant. The scapegoating of Jews during the plague, the breakdown of social bonds, the failure of institutions, these patterns have recurred in other crises. The plague revealed both the best and worst of human nature, selfless courage alongside cowardly abandonment, rational response alongside hysterical violence. Understanding this duality helps us recognize similar patterns in our own time. For historians, the Black Death serves as a case study in how catastrophic events can trigger transformative change. It accelerated the end of feudalism, weakened the church's authority, improved living standards for surviving peasants, contributed to urbanization and commercialization, and helped create conditions for the Renaissance and Reformation. This demonstrates how societies, even when they seem stable and eternal, can be fundamentally reshaped by external shocks. The plague did not create the forces that would transform medieval Europe into modern Europe, but it accelerated them dramatically. The pandemic also offers insights into how human societies remember and forget trauma. For those who lived through it, the Black Death was the defining event of their lives, an apocalypse that divided time into before and after. Yet within a few generations, it had become history, a story told by grandparents, then a legend, then a chapter in books. The visceral terror faded even as the structural changes it wrought persisted. This process of collective forgetting and remembering, of incorporating trauma into cultural memory while losing its immediate emotional impact, is something we can observe in real time with our own historical events. In literature and popular culture, the Black Death has become a symbol, a shorthand for apocalypse and societal collapse. From Albert Camus's novel The Plague, which used a fictional outbreak to explore responses to Nazism and oppression, to countless films and books featuring pandemic scenarios, the Black Death's shadow looms over our cultural imagination. It represents not just historical reality, but also our deepest fears about the fragility of civilization and the randomness of suffering. Perhaps what endures most powerfully is the Black Death's reminder of human mortality and the unpredictability of life. In our modern world, with its medical advances and technological marvels, it is easy to forget how precarious existence can be, how quickly normalcy can collapse, how little control we ultimately have. The medieval Europeans who faced the plague understood these truths with terrible clarity. Their experience speaks across the centuries, whispering truths about the human condition that remain relevant no matter how much material circumstances change. There is something eternal about the story of the Black Death, something that transcends its specific historical moment. It is a story about how people face the unimaginable, how societies respond to existential threats, how civilizations transform under pressure. It is about loss and survival, despair and resilience, breakdown and renewal. It reminds us that history is not just a chronicle of events, but a record of human experience, of suffering endured and overcome, of lessons learned at terrible cost. As we close this chapter and return to our own time, we carry with us the memory of those millions who died in agony, those who struggled to maintain their humanity in the face of overwhelming horror, those who survived and rebuilt. We remember not just to honor the dead or to satisfy historical curiosity, but because their experience illuminates our own. The Black Death was not just their catastrophe, but part of our shared human inheritance, a reminder that we are all vulnerable, all mortal, all connected by our common fragility and our common resilience. History remembers the plague, but we remember the people, the physicians who stayed at their posts, the priests who brought comfort to the dying, the parents who nursed their children through terrible suffering, the laborers who buried the dead when no one else would. We remember their courage and their failures, their faith and their doubt, their despair and their hope. In their story, we find our own story, for we are all survivors of disasters we never experienced, inheritors of a world shaped by catastrophes we did not witness, beneficiaries and victims of history's inexorable turning wheel. The Black Death changed humanity forever, and humanity endured. That, perhaps, is the greatest lesson, that even the worst catastrophe does not end the human story, but merely changes its direction. Life continues, adapting, evolving, finding new forms and new meanings. The plague killed half of Europe, but Europe survived, transformed, and eventually flourished. This resilience, this stubborn refusal to surrender to despair, this capacity to rebuild from ruins, this is humanity's most remarkable trait, its deepest truth, its eternal legacy, and so we leave the medieval dead to their rest, the plague pits to their silence, the abandoned villages to their ghosts. But we carry forward what they learned, what their suffering purchased, knowledge about disease and how to fight it, understanding of social change and how to navigate it, wisdom about human nature and how to honor it. The Black Death is history, yes, but it is also memory, lesson, warning, and testament. It reminds us that we are both fragile and strong, that civilization is both enduring and delicate, that life is both precious and precarious. In the quiet shadows of history, the Black Death still walks, not as a physical threat, but as a presence in our collective consciousness, a reminder of what humanity has endured and what it might face again. We study it not from morbid curiosity, but from wisdom, seeking to understand how our ancestors survived the unsurvivable, so that we, if called upon, might do the same.